Welcome to day 2 of the University of Michigan Obert C. Tanner Lecture on Artificial Intelligence and Human Values. My name is Alec Gallimore. I have the privilege of serving as the Robert J. Vlasic Dean of Engineering. Thank you to everyone who joined us yesterday afternoon for a fascinating lecture by none other than Eric Horvitz, Chief Scientific Officer at Microsoft. Eric, it's great to see you again, and thanks. Like yesterday, today's event is being recorded. We're eager to continue our discussion about artificial intelligence with human values with our cross-disciplinary panel of experts at the University of Michigan. I'd like to offer my thanks to Professor Peter Railton, Professor Richard Lewis, and Professor Rada Mihalcea for participating in today's panel. Members of the audience, we invite you to ask big questions and engage with our panelists during the public Q&A portion later this morning. It is through these interactions where we can bring our ideas together, draw upon critical insights, expertise, and wisdom from across a wide range of perspectives. And let me just add one more thing. What I find interesting is my area of research is plasma propulsion systems. And what I find fascinating about how I do research and what I'm hearing today is these are plasma drives that we develop. And yet, as scientists, we're trying to understand the phenomena that we create through our technology that we don't really understand, and we're trying to harness. And I think what we're hearing today is the same is true in AI. It's fascinating. It gives me great privilege and honor to welcome my colleague, Professor Ben Kuipers, who will introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alec. Wasn't that a fantastic talk yesterday? I really, really enjoyed it. That was really great. There are a lot of things that kind of stuck with me from that talk. But if I wanted to sort of crystallize out one particular bit, well, actually it's probably 2 bits, but there's the notion that back in our history, 45,000 or so years ago, there was this amazing transformational revolution. And in a comparatively short period of time, there was this symbolic revolution, a symbolic explosion, maybe a creative explosion. It was an explosion of a whole bunch of different things that happened. And so language, the creation of language was part of that and closely tied to that, but so was the creation of art. And it transformed what it meant to be human. And so that was clearly a pivotal point for our species. And it happened in a relatively short period of time. We spent some time trying to figure out how long that was. And we couldn't, but it was short on an evolutionary scale. Well, then the scary part, scary in a possibly in a good sense, probably in a good, we hope in a good sense, is that we may be entering a similar kind of time today. That the work that we're doing in the science, the technology, the implementations of artificial intelligence are creating new tools. And these are cognitive tools, but some of them are internally represented, some of them are externally represented, that show signs of being able to transform what it means to be human. Again. And it's happening in what is probably on a cosmic scale a short period of time. Now, it takes a while to get used to these cosmic scales, but and so here we are on the ground in the middle of it, and things seem to take a fairly long time. It was a while since I've been in graduate school, and I thought it was going to move faster. But in fact, cosmically, it really is almost a blink of the eye. This is touching all aspects of our human existence, and so we need a broad, interdisciplinary group of people to share the reactions that they have to the various parts of that. And so our panel is assembled to bring some, not all, but some of those interdisciplinary perspectives. And so Our panelists are three eminent scholars at the University of Michigan. The first speaker is going to be Peter Railton, who is Gregory S. Kavka Distinguished University Professor and John Stephenson Perrin Professor of Philosophy. Our second speaker will be Richard Lewis, who is John R. Anderson Collegiate Professor of Psychology, Linguistics, and Cognitive Science, and the director of the Weinberg Institute for Cognitive Science. And our third speaker is going to be Professor Rada Mihalcea, and she is Janice M. Jenkins, Collegiate Professor of Computer Science and Engineering, and she's the director of the Artificial Intelligence Lab. So each of them are going to have an opportunity to present their thoughts and responses to Eric's lecture, and more generally, their thoughts about the transformations that we're seeing. We'll have a short break so people can stand up and get themselves going again. And then Eric will have a chance to respond, and we'll have a discussion for a while between Eric and the other members of the panel. And then following that, we'll open up for questions and discussion with the whole audience. So I think this is going to be extremely exciting and help amplify the message from last night. So let me turn the podium over to Peter. Well, actually, I think maybe you could present from there. If you wish to be up here, it's fine. But this is sort of a discussion among the three.
No, I don't know that I need the podium in order to feel official here. I also realize that we all want to discuss these questions, and I'll try not to think in terms of cosmic time in making my remarks. Thank you all for being here at this hour of the morning to discuss these important issues, and I thank the organizers of this lecture for making this opportunity possible for us to come together and discuss these things. And I also was very struck by the sort of pilgrimage that Eric carried out, going back to the origins of human language and reasoning. And who could not be moved, really, by these images of someone putting a hand on the ceiling of a cave and making its outline and wanting that to stay there for others. And that's a point I want to draw attention to here, which is humans have an extremely powerful need to communicate, and to communicate to others, and not just others who happen to be in our circle or in our kin group. It's a distinctive characteristic of human sociability that we can be social and cooperative with strangers across a very wide space. And so that, among other things, is part of what happened, I think, 40,000 years ago. It became possible for us to have much larger groups, and larger groups can help us make ourselves more intelligent. And I think also AI can help make us more intelligent. So this is a contemporary explosion, not just of artificial intelligence, but of human intelligence, because there's no reason not to think that this is something we can integrate into our capacity to be intelligent beings. And there's a tremendous amount of excitement and potential there. So I want to just raise a couple of points, which I hope will encourage further discussion. And the first has to do with how to take advantage of the distinctive learning powers of AI in order to develop a kind of sensitivity to ethically relevant features of situations. We don't have to think that these AI agents would be full-fledged moral agents with all the moral emotions we feel. If you ask a psychologist, the psychologist will tell you that emotion is really a functional organization of the organism. The feeling is one expression of it, but it's not the core. And so thinking about the question of how humans would interact with these machines is also a question about how these machines could learn about our emotions and use that information. And as we saw last time, there is an ethical challenge here, which is, I gather Microsoft is not shipping emotion recognition intelligence. So one question is, if we want these machines to be as intelligent as they can be, will they have to be capable of recognizing emotion? I'll just tell a little story about that. I have a colleague who heard me make some similar remarks and said, I can tell you something that will help you think about this. one day his son came home from school very agitated, and he was upset because his teacher had scolded him. And this man, Don, asked why, and his child said, well, I was going to school, and there was an older woman, and she was extremely distressed and agitated because her cat was up in a tree, and it was a small tree. And so I climbed the tree and brought the cat down to her. And the cat was relieved, and she was relieved. And I was so pleased with this that when we had show and tell at school, I told the class, I just rescued a cat for an old lady who was extremely upset. And the teacher said, what? You mean your parents never told you not to climb trees? And he said, of course they did, but they weren't thinking of this case. And so part of what is going to be required for machines, artificial agents, to be ethically sensitive is for them to be sensitive to exactly the dynamic of that situation, which makes it distinctive from other situations of climbing a tree. And what's interesting is not just that he was sensitive to the woman's upset, but that he understood the situation in school as well. He understood why the teacher was scolding him, but he also understood what an answer would be. And one of the things that we know about language is that language is founded not just upon intelligence and reasoning, but upon a capacity to understand conversational settings and follow certain kinds of norms of conversation, giving people accurate information, relevant information, doing it in the right tone. Don's child couldn't address the teacher in a saucy tone and expect a good result. But he knew the register to use in talking to his teacher, just as you all know the register to use in participating in this discussion. And so you can think that the cluster of abilities centered around language is really a very rich set, and it is a normative set. It includes our ability to read situations and to be relevant and valuable to one another communicatively. And this is a remarkable fact about humans. I can ask directions in strange cities, and people don't send me into traps or alleyways typically. So far, it hasn't happened. I hope it won't happen to any of you. And so that's an element of what we could think of as default trust in others and in the use of language, that they'll use language typically honestly, they'll use words trying to communicate with us, and that they will want to do that. They will want to communicate with us. And so if we think about language then as an ability that evolved, we also have to think, well, look at all this infrastructure, psychic infrastructure that's needed to really get language going. Animals signal to each other, and they use signals strategically and effectively with one another. And I don't want to say anything bad about animals. Every time I learn more about animals, I'm impressed with how much we've misestimated their capacities. So I won't say anything bad about animals, but one thing humans can do is we can manage this kind of interaction and negotiate the normative space around it, as well as the physical, environmental space, and so on. So think about self-driving cars. Self-driving cars are going to have to negotiate a social space. As they get better and better, they're going to get better and better at reading the effective intentions of other cars, other drivers. They will know when, in a situation, a car is being belligerent, when in a situation it's being cooperative, when they can merge, when they can't, when they have to team together with other cars to prevent a bully from merging. And so gradually, as they become more intelligent drivers, they will become better at modeling a fuller personality, a human personality, but also the personality that is expressed by artificial agents as well. And so thinking then about how we can leverage the skills and capacities that underlie language, think about the AI setting in which the better machines get at this kind of successful interaction with humans, the more they're implicitly modeling normative relations, human psychology, and we aren't necessarily going to have to program it into them. In fact, I guess the lesson of recent years anyhow in AI is don't try to write some axioms for human psychology or some distinguished set of features to recognize these states. Allow the machine to learn them from large bodies of data with a lot of computing power. And this means we're going to have to let the machines also communicate with one another in order to be effective agents, and to sometimes display a kind of autonomy with respect to us. So imagine an AI agent that's a human home health aide. And the person the agent is with has been showing signs of being a bit depressed. Something about the language used, the tone of voice. And so this person doesn't want the machine to report anything negative. It's one of those people who doesn't want to get bad news or give bad news to doctors. Understanding that situation and understanding a responsibility to report even symptoms that the individual would not prefer that you report is going to be essential. We wouldn't trust a human to be a human health aide who had no sensitivity to these ethical considerations and no ability to say no at a certain point to a person or to withhold a medication at a certain point. And that means the systems are going to have a degree of autonomous on-board ethical sensitivity. There won't be a human in every loop, there can't be. And to the extent that the machines are learning to be successful drivers or human health aides, that is going to require that we understand what it would take for such a system to have on-board ethical sensitivity. And I suspect that it's going to require reading emotions, but it may not be necessary that we give emotion recognition software out like candy, and it may be that the implicit modeling that will take place as these systems get more and more diffused and more used will be sufficient. Now, this isn't an issue about sentience. I'm not asking whether artificial agents feel particular sentiments. We have interactions with agents like corporations and institutions. They don't have emotions or feelings, but they do have plans. They have intentions. They have goals and concerns. And our interaction with them is going to be regulated by those. But you also have to learn, I know what this dean's office is like to negotiate with. I'm sure it's excellent in engineering. And so the capacity of a system to interact with agents in a way that understands their plans, purposes, goals, commitments, is something that does not require that the other agent necessarily have feeling. It's sufficient that the other agent have those mental states in their functional role. And that's just my last point. We've been talking about collaboration, human-AI collaboration. And people who work on these issues, primatologists, for example, sometimes distinguish between cooperation and collaboration. Chimps are apparently very good at cooperation. Some would argue, Tomasello argues, they're less good at collaboration because they're not as good at the kind of joint attention that's necessary for collaboration and the ability to take the other's interests into account non-strategically, to think that the other has equal standing in determining what's going to happen. And so think of collaboration that is not just cooperation, which can happen among mutually antagonistic people to achieve some stasis between them, let's say. But think of collaboration as forming joint projects with people in which each member takes seriously the interests and concerns of the other member as having some intrinsic weight. And that's indeed what we see in language. We didn't hear much about what the interests or concerns or goals of AI agents might be. If we're going to collaborate with them, then we're going to need to look at their side of the collaboration and understand what might matter to them. Now, I might say, well, they don't have emotions, nothing matters to them. But again, caring is not a distinctive feeling, it's a distinctive functional concern. It's having a goal, having a reward function, having a value. And these agents will learn reward values on the way to accomplishing whatever purpose we give them. So, for example, they'll learn how to keep themselves in reasonable condition in order to carry out their task, because they can't carry out the task, achieve the goal, until they take care of their condition. But that may mean AI systems are going to care about their condition. We didn't ask them to, but to do their job well, they will do that. And so a question I wanted to raise is, how are people at Microsoft thinking about this question of what the artificial agent is going to be like, and what collaboration would be with an artificial agent who had the capacities for this kind of interaction, but also the capacities for their own goals, their own concerns. And they may form relations with one another that are relations of mutual trust, for example, or distrust. And so the second question I wanted to raise is, we often ask, how can we trust these AI systems? And obviously, that's a vital question to ask. How can they trust us? How can we develop relations with AI systems such that they will be genuine collaborative partners? And that requires a kind of mutual trust and mutual understanding. So I don't know the answers to any of these questions or how even to begin thinking about them, but I'm sure people at Microsoft and Eric have been thinking about them, and I'd like to hear more. Thank you.
Okay, Rick?
So thank you. I'd like to echo Peter's thanks to Emily and Ben and the organizers, Eric and Sarah for coming a long distance. This is a real privilege to be a part of this, so I'm very excited to be here. Eric yesterday gave an inspiring vision of a future in which AI-human synergies may lead to greater... I don't have my mic. Sorry about that. No, you're fine. All right, there we are. Okay. So you missed the most important part, which was the thank you. Okay, it's all downhill from now. Eric yesterday gave an inspiring vision of a future in which AI-human synergies may lead to greater human flourishing, and also a peek at the practical efforts underway to help ensure that deployment of AI technologies aligns with our values, codified in the cycle of responsibility. Jenna yesterday asked a very important question about whether the cycle of responsibility scales. So in the first part of my remarks, I want to identify what could be a fundamental problem that might mean that the answer to that question is no. The problem concerns the development of systems that, as Eric described yesterday, are beginning to show the glimmers of general intelligence, glimmers that in the short term are almost certain to become brighter. I'm going to perhaps too glibly call the problem of the value-free learner, and it very much relates to topics that Peter just discussed. But then I want to finish on a more optimistic note and take a long-term view and ask what might be over the rainbow, appealing to Eric's arc of intelligence, and ask how AI might help us to make genuinely new moral progress. So let me start with the problem first, and then we'll end up somewhere over the rainbow. The problem starts to come into focus by considering large-scale language models such as GPT, Gopher, and others that have been making the news and driving recent AI advances, including some of the most stunning new capacities for creativity that Eric showcased yesterday. The scale of data used to train these models is staggering. The most recent models have essentially been trained on all the text on the internet, including much of recorded human writing. So they're in many ways like holding up a giant mirror to humanity, and so we should not be surprised if we do not always like what we see. The capacity of these models to generate toxic speech is well known, as is their reflection of all kinds of human biases that we think don't reflect our highest human values. And so there's a great deal of important work going on in the area of critiquing, testing, and mitigating these issues. For example, Emily Bender, a computer scientist at the University of Washington, is a leading voice in these efforts. DeepMind just published a big recent paper outlining 6 potential risks of ethical and social harm coming from the use of language models. And these are all important and urgent projects, and there may be indeed some progress happening in reducing bias and the potential for toxic output. But I think this could be just the tip of a much bigger iceberg. And so I want to use language models to illustrate what could be a fundamental problem in building generally intelligent systems with human level and beyond human level knowledge and competence, including a competence for ethical and moral judgment of the kind that Peter was just discussing. So the way we have arrived at powerful language models is an instance of what Rich Sutton, one of the founders of the modern field of reinforcement learning, famously and provocatively called the bitter lesson for AI. And he actually did so here at Michigan at Weinberg Symposium a few years ago, and I can tell you it was indeed provocative when I was in the room, okay? So the bitter lesson is roughly that any attempt to engineer or build in complex knowledge or capacities into AI systems will only yield short-term and narrow and brittle gains, and will always be overcome by methods that learn that will always be overcome by more data and more compute. And so GPT-3 and their ilk are clear examples that have completely leapfrogged any attempt to engineer in the rules and representations and structures of human language. Rich Sutton had a great phrase to go along with this that I actually like better than the bitter lesson, and it was the irredeemably complex contents of the human mind, which as engineers we cannot hope to codify by hand. So philosophers of ethics like Peter tell us that human-level ethical competence may be similarly irredeemably complex, and so the only way to endow our systems with such competence is through learning, with apologies to Peter for not only putting words in his mouth, but putting Rich's words in his mouth. But to see the problem here, we need to attend to something far more interesting and surprising that's going on with language models. These models are trained on text using the simple task of predict the next word. But they yield not only state-of-the-art and qualitatively new language capacities, they give rise to emergent capacities for planning and reasoning. They can be used to suggest new courses of action in novel situations. They can provide the foundation for human-level acts of creativity. To me, this is one of the great discoveries, not just for AI, but for cognitive science. So if you would like stark new evidence for the conjecture that language and culture is indeed the secret sauce of human intelligence, you are seeing it unfold daily. Now, these language models are, not surprisingly, being joined with, by large foundation models trained on humanity's storehouse of video. So it's no longer crazy talk, I think, in AI to conjecture that common sense and even detailed knowledge about how the world works will emerge from training on such data. Capacities to reason about the physical world, the social world, and yes, even the moral and ethical world. Okay, so now I can finally state my concern about the value-free learner. Whether you like it or not, some kind of moral and ethical competence will implicitly emerge in models trained on predict the next word or predict the next observation. There is already evidence for that. Will this moral and ethical competence be the one that we want? These models will become the most powerful and useful computational artifacts on the planet, and the economic and other pressures to use them will be tremendous. And while they may not, in the short term, achieve the grand vision of autonomous AGI, as part of the global democratization of AI, they will be used and deployed in so many varied settings and in so many different ways, we can only begin to imagine the scope. And in many of these settings, their implicit values and implicit ethical capacities are bound to be expressed. And again, even if only implicitly. Will our current approach of trying to anticipate and then mitigate possible AI harms be sufficient? So this makes me wonder if in the long term the path to human-like moral competence and values in AI systems must necessarily go through something like the kind of learning a child engages in. So developmental psychologists like our own Felix Varnigan here in Michigan Psychology tell us that young children are, yes, learning how the world works through observation and active experimentation, learning values from those around them, but they're also at astonishingly young ages, pre-linguistically, doing things like making character judgments, spontaneously engaging in acts of cooperation, helping and sharing or judging, and rejecting rules from authority figures that violate fairness or harm norms. In other words, their fire hose of data is filtered through a developing value system from very early on. So I'm wondering if whether, unlike capacities such as language, common sense physics, maybe even theory of mind, and so on, where we might be able to some extent leapfrog past the need to build in what amounts to what cognitive psychologists and linguists call universal grammar. Moral and ethical competence may fall into a different category. We may indeed need to endow our learning systems with an aspect of human cognitive nature that corresponds to what some cognitive scientists call universal moral grammar, the endowment that kids bring to the table when they're learning their values. So it's a project that will help us understand ourselves in a deep way. It's an exciting project for AI and cognitive science, but it is also a very tall order. Okay, now I want to strike a more optimistic and even more speculative note now, and ask what might be over the rainbow, and ask how it might be possible for AI to help us make moral progress. So think of this as a kind of grand challenge for ethical AI. This is about a certain kind of human-AI synergy that could lead to changes in our values. Now, I have to say, I'm really deep in over my head now, but I'm about to surface and appeal to something in current-day AI, so just bear with me, all right? So I think there are at least two ways that AI systems might help us to improve on our own moral and ethical capacities that seems not too far-fetched. One is simply helping us to think through things more clearly, helping us to understand the implications of our explicitly expressed values for the choices we ought to make in complex situations. So think of an artificial applied philosopher of ethics that you can, I don't know, carry around in your pocket and have available 24/7 that will help you to simulate the consequences of different courses of actions and understand how they align or not with your own values. So that kind of assistance, at least in narrow domain seems tractable to me. Eric was starting to imagine such a system yesterday for self-driving cars. So a related kind of help might be discovering new moral truths that are the implications of existing values and existing or newly discovered empirical facts. And such an AI might help us see when we are mistaking some of our cherished beliefs for intrinsic values when in fact they are empirically contingent. I'm not sure I even know what that means, but it sounds good. But what about moral progress that allows us to leap past where we are as a species, that lets us advance our values? If we look at our past, we like to think that we see markers of moral progress. But of course, we should do so with a great deal of humility, because consider people 100 years from now. I hope there are people 100 years from now that may not look back on us as that generation that arrived at the golden and final period of enlightened moral development. That seems somewhat unlikely to me. And so I want to consider how AI might possibly accelerate progress and even lead to positive change in human values. So what kind of mechanism could do this? So one possibility is to understand the evolutionary, both cultural and biological and historical pressures that led to what our values and moral competence are now. And then to ask how these pressures may or may not be aligned with our current circumstances. So, we understand very well how aspects of our biological inheritance may not be well adapted to modern life. We live in a world in which there are more chocolate bars than carrots, and so, we might be better off with a neural reward system that registers carrots as more delicious than chocolate. That's, I think, easy to understand. Now, it turns out there's a formal framework in computational reinforcement learning that may be helpful here, and it's really an instance of the bounded optimality perspective that in AI that Eric has made seminal contributions to. And it also makes salient a kind of adaptive pressure that is often overlooked, which is adaptation to the structure of the mind itself. So the framework is called optimal rewards, and it's, again, related to things that Peter was just talking about. And it's something we've actually developed here at Michigan over the years. The idea is very simple. So the standard reinforcement learning problem starts with the reward function that specifies the goals of the agent. And the agent is said to receive a reward signal from the environment as it behaves. Maybe it's a robot that receives a reward for moving forward and is trying to learn to walk. So we don't know how to directly program the irredeemably complex control policies for walking, but it's easy to specify the reward function for moving forward. And the agent uses this reward to drive learning, trying to arrive at an optimal way of behaving to maximize reward. But where do rewards come from? So of course, for biological agents, reward are signals computed by the brain. And so reward functions were evolved in some way. This simple observation was one of the things that led us to formulate a meta-optimization problem, the optimal reward problem. And it simply asks, for a given objective function that I care about, And a given learning agent, with all of its idiosyncratic computational bounds, in a given environment or distribution of environments, what's the best reward function to give this agent to motivate learning so that the agent maximizes the objective function that I really care about? And now the counterintuitive answer is that for computationally bounded learning agents, the best reward to give is often not the objective reward, and that the best reward depends on not just the environment, but the structure of the mind of the agent itself. So this is the bounded optimality perspective on reward and values. So perhaps something like this framework, when given grand objectives for human flourishing, however we work out how to define those, may derive new rewards or values that bounded agents of different kinds in different environments should care about to better maximize the grand flourishing objective. The fact is, as humans, we may not have optimal rewards or values. For example, we might imagine as humans we're wired up to care more about locality than we should because our value system evolved in settings where great action at a distance or knowledge from a distance was not possible. And it also suggests that simple alignment of human values and AI values may not always be the best solution because we are different kinds of bounded agents. So how might new derived values be instilled? So I'm not thinking about robotic AI neurosurgeons rewiring our brains, but you can imagine perhaps AI designed curricula that lead to such changes and accelerate progress. So I'm asking all of us, is this a kind of human-AI synergy, which involves a kind of direct interaction of human values? Does it all seem within reach? And if it is it something we should aspire to? Thanks.
So Rada.
I would like to second my panelists here in thanking Eric for taking the trip and persevering. We persevered in inviting him over 2 years, and he stuck with us, and I'm grateful. I really enjoyed the presentation yesterday. It's been very inspiring, and that's what I've heard from the other people in the audience. That's been great. And what I would like to make as an argument today, thinking of how we are the ones who are making AI, we don't very often think on how is AI sort of making us or changing us, and especially how is it changing our values. So I would like to take a detour and remind you of something you may all be familiar with but may have forgotten for a moment. How many of you remember Clippy?
I do.
With hat tip to Jenna for the connections, it turns out that Eric was involved in making Clippy. So I had the curiosity to look at the history of Clippy. It was introduced in 1997, and it was part of pretty much all Microsoft Office products. An example of Clippy in action was you type in Microsoft Word, "Dear," and then Clippy will come and ask, "Are you writing a letter? Do you want me to help you?" It might not have been perfect, but it was definitely much more than the other systems that we had at the time. And yet, we somehow were all annoyed. So the question is, why was that? And has anything changed since Clippy? We have these days other systems like Alexa or Siri or Cortana, which kind of have similar attempts to interact with us, and yet we somehow don't seem that annoyed. So certainly there has been a lot of progress in AI. Eric has highlighted some of that progress. I'm really proud to be part of one of the largest and most impactful AI labs worldwide. We make progress in a lot of different directions within AI and computer vision, natural language processing, machine learning, robotics. We are really witnessing an explosion of AI technologies. Eric mentioned, and also Rich mentioned, the GPT-3 models. There is a Turing models from Microsoft. They all have very impressive performance when it comes to predicting or generating language, and much more, like really helping us get access to this realm of knowledge. But I believe aside from progress in AI, there is something else that might have changed. I think it's not only that AI has changed, it's also that we have changed as well. And I think we will continue to change for at least as long as AI will be different. So just think of a moment of human-human interaction, and that has been brought up as an example. In this room, we happen to all be speaking English, and so we communicate well with one another using this means of this particular language. But as it turns out, there are many more languages out there. This is also one of my favorite trivia questions. I'm curious if people know how many languages are spoken out there. Some numbers. 3,000, 500. So there are 7,000 languages, not counting dialects. So it's a lot of languages. So chances that we will run into somebody who doesn't speak English are fairly high. So think, for instance, of Quechua. So Quechua is spoken in South America. It has nearly 10 million speakers. And if you can imagine running into somebody who only speaks Quechua and nothing else, then how would you communicate? Once you figure that you don't speak the same language, likely you will not try to address them in formal English, and you might try something else. So maybe you will try gestures, maybe drawing, and lots of other tricks. But in the end, it will be some kind of limited interaction. So I believe this is what's happening when we interact with AI. The AI is sort of trying hard, but I think on our side, we are also trying hard, whether we realize it or not. And in the process, we are also changing how we behave, how we think, and at some point, we may also be changing our own deep human values. So I would like to give some examples of these changings we are experiencing. I will continue for a moment in the space of language communication and go back in time for just a few years, thinking of the search engines that I believe many of you in this room have experienced, which were exclusively based on keywords. So at that time, if you remember, in particular if you're often using search engines, instead of saying things that come natural to us, like I'm traveling to Italy and I need to rent a car in Rome, we would say something like rent car Rome. Instead of saying, is red wine healthier than white wine, we might say something like red wine, white wine health, and then hope that something will come back. After you do a lot of that, we would eventually limit what kind of knowledge and information we may look for, as Rich was pointing out to rewards. If there is no reward for certain kind of information that we would seek or knowledge, we may not even look for that. So for instance, if I would like to ask a complicated thing, such as are human values changing after a long interaction with AI, the argument that I'm making here, I probably will not attempt to ask that question online because I don't expect a reward back. So if we were to continue that thread, the change we've been experiencing is a simplification of our thoughts and a simplification of the kind of knowledge that we would expect. I said a few years back, I believe progress has been made. We now see search engines that can get more than just keywords. It's not yet at the full natural interactions we have, but there is progress. And so maybe that will not necessarily continue as an issue. Now, staying a little longer in the realm of search engines, Eric brought in his presentation yesterday the issue of bias, and that was also brought here by my fellow panelists. I'm thinking of an example that Safiya Noble gave as she was looking online for a phrase such as Latina girl, which may be a common phrase for a little Latina girl who's trying to see who are other people sharing their identity. And as it turned out, almost exclusively the results were pages that were pointing to pornography. And so you could think of this little Latina girl who's looking online, looking for other people, and what do they find? Like, what is the image that the world has about them? And the same other people, non-Latina girls, who will look online for things like who are Latina girls, and that's what they would find, right? So these are really things that expose us to stereotypes that we might not have, but we'll learn them just by using AI systems. Another example, still online, are fake news. We've seen a huge increase in misinformation over the past few years. This goes all the way from false news articles or social media posts to AI-generated videos, the so-called deep fakes. There is, of course, the effect of wrong information. I'm thinking back to examples that were given by high-profile politicians on how maybe taking chlorine would help with COVID-19. And that can have really nefarious impacts. Like people actually literally follow the content of that. It can be really impactful in very bad ways. But I believe there is also another effect, which we may not be often thinking about, which is the fact that we are losing trust in knowledge and information. If when we go online or interact with AI agents, what we get back is something we aren't sure whether it's correct or not, next time, if I talk to somebody, I will have that doubt in my head. Is this true or not? So losing trust, and actually Peter pointed out, we have that default trust as one of our core elements. But I believe that's changing because of that presence of misinformation online. There is another example of mistrust that will likely surface with self-driving cars. Those were brought up as examples, and this is credit to Ben Kuipers from conversations we had before, thinking of how we would interact with self-driving cars. Currently, there are a few here and there, including here in Ann Arbor, but it's a very small fraction, to the point that our assumption when we see a car, we assume there is a human driver behind the wheel. But as that will be changing, how will that impact the trust that we have? So currently, for instance, and the example that Ben and I discussed, if I attempt to cross the road and there is a car approaching, I will eventually look at the driver, I see the driver sees me, and then I start crossing. If I look at the driver, but there is no driver, then what? So how do I have trust that that vehicle will actually stop? So that, I think, requires new thinking of how that, what that implies. And there are also more subtle examples. I often think I mention, and those were mentioned multiple times, this chat agents that we interact with, like Alexa or Siri, Cortana. And one thing that you may have noticed that most of these agents have a woman voice. What does that mean? Are we typically speaking politely with them? Probably not. It's like, Alexa, tell me the time. Alexa, what's the weather? Alexa, give me a recipe. So ordering around a female character tells us something. I'm sometimes wondering about my own children. What are they learning by ordering around an agent like Alexa? There is also the fact that I just mentioned, the fact that we are not typically kind and empathetic with these agents. And that's because of that lack of reward. We don't necessarily feel we get that back. But how will that change the way we interact with our own fellow humans once the number of such interactions we have with AI agents will increase? If I form the habit of ordering someone around, I may also try it with Rich or maybe Eric and see if that will change me. And I could keep going on. Eric mentioned examples of AIs from the future, like the safety net for human errors. And I think that's all great, but I wonder how would that change us? Would we be less cautious because we know there is that safety net? Or AI that will help us not forget? I'm actually not sure that I want to be not forgetful. I think it's fine to forget certain things. So I will leave it there. I do ultimately believe we need AI. There are dangers in AI technologies we build, like the fire example that Eric had on a slide. And if we think back or imagine back millions of years when we invented fire, should we have known that it can also lead to dangers? Would we have not invented fire? Probably not. Probably would, which is really what we do. We'll learn how to contain it. I think at some point AI is like that. We need it, but we'll have to to learn how to contain it. As human beings, we are ultimately constrained by our own flesh and spirit. I often think about the planet, and nowadays even more so with the climate change and everything happening, and how fragile we really are. And I think if we want to surpass our own human condition, we really need technology, and eventually we need AI. But as we think of building AI with human values, my question is, how will AI be changing us?
Thank you very much to Peter, Rick, and Rada. We're going to take about a 10-minute stretch break right now, and then Eric is going to get a chance to respond, and then we'll have discussion among the panel.
Might people like a 15 or 20-minute stretch break so I can kneel here? I mean, just hearing these comments, these wonderful comments.
Aren't these wonderful comments?
The reason worth coming out alone. Sit with my colleagues here.
Absolutely.
10 minutes sounds good. So
10
I'm
minutes.
Just teasing about things.
Right. 5 after. Eric had probably thought that he had finished taking his oral doctoral exam some number of years ago. But lucky him, we have a new chance here. And so this is Eric's chance to respond to his committee. So, and to the rest of us.
Right, and wasn't my mic not on? Hello? There we go. So let me just say that my committee was Pat Suppies, who you might know, Ron Howard, George Danzig, and Ted Shortliff. This committee is as esteemed, so fabulous. I mentioned Pat Suppies because I'm sure our resident philosopher will have known his work. Well, first of all, thanks for incredibly deep and inspiring comments. Each coming from a different point of view and perspective and personality and history of scholarship. So it's really interesting to hear. Let me first say that the good news for any downside that might be coming up in people's minds is we're only in the early days of AI. Kind of like AI is an infant. As I said yesterday, we're going to be relying on deep scholarship, deep thinking, new ideas, ongoing touch, monitoring of the situation, and guiding the course of how AI goes in its multiple tentacles and directions as it interleaves with our minds and with our culture and society, and we with it over time. And just sitting at breakfast this morning and seeing the students here and other faculty with interest raises my confidence that all the issues and ideas that just came up will be under great supervision and guidance over the next number of decades when it's going to be critical to start getting things on good tracks to the future on that arc of intelligence that we're all riding on. So I want to start with one of Rick's comments and perspective, which is one of the limited cognitive resources, the bounded cognition we all grapple with daily, whether we're cognizant in our boundedness about what's happening or not. And in many ways, starting from that viewpoint where thinking about values is almost by definition limited thinking about values. We have at the forefront of our minds maybe some examples, some cases in our minds, some trades, some codified heuristics, some sense of ourself and our principles when we think briefly about who it is that we are and how we act in different situations. And maybe when we see a situation that might have an opportunity for a decision or action that would lead to, under uncertainty, some implications, we can jump to our templates quickly or have a quick reaction as to what my values are in terms of how I might guide what I do. And that also might affect us under longer term decisions as we reflect or think through, again, taking action under future uncertainty given an opportunity to choose in the world. That said, to me, means that there will always be opportunity for individuals to learn more about values and to help define and codify and maybe crystallize and generalize values about action in the world and implications and outcomes. And in some ways, I see it important to divide things up a bit. When an action is taken and there's a certain value judgment about that action, there is a sense that there's a shared or groundedness in the evaluator, whether it be the self or other, about what the implications actually are. What are the outcomes? So this idea of like the common sense or the realities of what one's actions in the world lead to in terms of the the spectrum of actions and which is more likely to happen. Then, for each of the possible actions that happens, including the one that does or the one that's most likely in advance of the action, there's a notion of a value judgment. And if it involves a trade of some kind, there's a codification or some assessment of a weighing we'll just say for now, the costs and benefits of potentially different outcomes that may have come from different actions leading to the outcomes. So you see there's lots of components to this. It's a very rich and deep problem. I would suggest that the codification of the high-level principles, sometimes that are called deontological reasoning, thou shalt not kill, square brackets, no matter what, versus consequentialism. I'm not going to go to a kill example, but you always weigh the situation. You think deeply about implications under uncertainty and say, okay, I've gone through my, we'll even call it a full decision analysis, and here's how I feel, and here's my value structure, and why. My suggestion is, or my reflection is that these are challenging in the implications aspects as well as the cost-benefit aspects of any decision, and we often, and whether or not we can rely back on a crystallized deontologic rule or generalization, it still makes it difficult, and it's not so clear. So my hope, number one, is that AI systems that we build and guide towards helping us in the future will help us to better understand implications and trades in a clear way by just helping us to visualize, understand, simulate, probe in a good way, in a pedagogical way, so we get better at grappling with our bounded cognitive approach to understanding values, even our own personal values, whether it be through a limited access to our previous behaviors and how we thought about them and what we want to do in the future, or some crystallized notions that might be indeed, in the end, quite brittle when they're probed and pushed. So I can imagine a system someday that can actually think through with us and say, okay, working on an action, I'm personalized, I've been working with you for a while, I've followed you, I'm doing my best to not inject the mega biases that I've learned from all of human history and my writing, per the suggestion that Richard had, that these systems, Rick had, that these systems will learn and we can't understand where they're going to come from. But let's just say for now, and we'll get back to this idea of how they might be secretly biased in the future and in a way that's unavoidable. Let's just say they're going to help us probe implications, the trades, and help us recognize places where we're truly in dark matter. We have never really thought deeply about an edge case or the implications of a principle that we have. And they explore together with us or other humans, even in a group setting, to take deeper dives on the values. Wouldn't it be interesting to find out in a particular case that you think you know about your values, that an edge case, maybe a less likely implication of something that, an action that you would take or say was a good thing to do, even at the likelihood of it happening in a specific condition, has such grave consequences when you roll out the implications, it changes your thinking about your crystallized rule or your consequential inferences when a similar setting arises in the future. So I have a feeling that we can all benefit. We would all benefit by any number of tools, whether they're AI powered or not. You could be reading a book, you could be looking at reflections of scholars we haven't read yet in our lives that might change how we think about things. But certainly an interactive approach of a computational mechanism or a system that lives with us, understands where we've come so far on these kinds of deliberations, or even watches us outside of these deliberations explicitly to help us, could go a long way with making us more true to who we want to be. Maybe popping up to a higher level goal of who we want to be as of leaving that on the table for now. On the idea of that, I think it's a really important question that Rick brought up of the impossibility of an unbiased system in critical ways, or in important ways, and in the prospect of emergence of values that we don't understand, even those that may be withheld from us actively by a future AI system. I agree that's a concern. And therefore, we might want to be working on that today or yesterday to make sure this all goes well. I do have the sense in watching how models perform and playing with these GPT-3, for example, and other models like that, we see how in-context learning works and zero shot. One thing that I've actually done, maybe it'll make us feel better if you've tried this yourself, is you can tell a system, you can actually give a system prompts about values and watch how the system crystallizes that, takes that forward in a particular context that you're working with the system within. So, yes, let's just say for a second, and then going back to what Peter was saying, and thank you, Peter, for your comments, that a system is learning about many different values in the world, and it's unclear how it's going to apply all that. Will be the average, or what does it know? Well, I would suggest that these systems will have the ability, as they're showing today, when it comes to, again, zero shot, or in context learning, we just give a simple context and you get this incredible knife edge of a focus of attention, that these systems you'll be able to focus them very quickly to come up with, from all of humanities, from all the learnings it has about values, to an interesting, specific, semi-generalized chunk that is you, or that's quite close to you, where you've gotten so far with your explorations. So I'm hopeful, and what I'm trying to get at here is, what I feel in these systems that I'm seeing is the prospect that things could be guided, I suspect, in really fabulous ways for humanity and for individuals. They can also go off the rails. So it's we're in a high-stakes situation. It's part of the reason I flew out here. I think we really have to get on this together. And these kinds of comments, I mean, you heard today, I mean, look, this is being recorded. It'll be on YouTube. So when you see this conversation agent of the future, it'll be indexing this, right, Rick and Peter and Rada? When you see this, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's got to go well. Listen to all these ideas. These are all critically important, and you'll hear the questions from the audience in a few minutes. Now, isn't it amazing right now that we know these systems are so broadly indexing everything that one or more will be seeing this lecture, hearing these words, and integrating and incorporating these ideas in a way that they'll be potentially generalized as well as made specifically available in a zero-shot sense. So I'm optimistic that if hearing these thoughts today, and looking at all of you, that we are going to make it go well. We'll be on it. On the systems changing us, Rada, it's so interesting to say that we're always changing with all these technologies, and I hope I can share this. Maybe Rada gave me a little bit of a heads up, even though she didn't know it. Yesterday, we had a meeting with some of the faculty, and she just said I'm not sure when you said this, but you said, you know, once in a while, I feel like I'm trying to do a control Z, an undo on something that just happened in life. And I go, oh yeah, this is life, it's not the computer. Right? And so she's been thinking about this.
That's a way of changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and, you know, even like copy paste, you know, whatever it might be. So we are being changed by the metaphors and ideas and possibilities, and sometimes the possibilities we see in the digital world, like undo, we just can't, we have to sort of remind ourselves, oh boy, I have to treat life a little bit differently, be a little more careful. And so it's interesting to think about the changes. Sometimes there's a sort of an interesting, you know, mapping between the digital and our real world, where we use our knowledge and we take it forward in this sort of an interplay. I have to say that people remember the first time you got in just your first drive in a car with your parent, with a permit, on a side street, typically. And then I remember when my father first said, okay, now take it out on the road. And I just remember how it felt to all of a sudden be in this setting where I was shocked. I said, people can do whatever they want with these gigantic 2-ton things. People are moving around. I said, what do you, and I didn't even understand the signals that I needed to have to be a social agent in this space. It was so frightening. And then within a few weeks, it's like you're palming the wheel. You know, you understand what it all means. You understand how signals work, because you're adapting to the world of like a world of 2-ton vehicles with a steering wheel and a kind of a braking system adapted to how humans communicate more generally. Because it's kind of a shift, but we get used to that, and it's kind of a human orientation because it seems to work and it evolved that way, and it's semi-robust. So it's very interesting to think about, you know, the interplay between the things we design and how they work and how we'll shape them over time and make them human-oriented. And yes, they'll change us, but we'll be changing them too. And to be successful, they'll have to sort of fold with us in an elegant way over time. It's interesting. One of the comments I didn't make yesterday, but in my research on the symbolic explosion, was that the structure of languages with what's called the universal grammar that Rick pointed out just now may have come because that's the way rich signaling evolved, constrained by human brains. You know, in other words, like there was an existing infrastructure and it may have been inefficient, and it may have gotten, plus or minus different arguments, it may have gotten more efficient over time, given pressures once it got going with this. But the idea that the way we talk, the way we use noun phrases and verb phrases and recurse on sentence structures is a reflection of the natural organic artifice that was there in the cognitive substrate of minds that existed when this language is coming to be more sophisticated. So there has to be sort of an interplay of sorts, and you can imagine that the constraints of who it is that we are in some ways won't be completely demolished by an AI system, but it's more like they'll be co-evolving because there's a need to work elegantly together. But there will be changes, potentially. There's so many more thoughts that I've had. I mean, I've had sheets of paper. In fact, this is very valuable to me, so I'm going to be talking to all three of you, I think, in the future as I think more about what you've said today. And I realize we have limited time for these opening remarks, and I'm not even sure. Oh, 2-minute warning, good. I'm because I can go on forever. So let me make a couple more comments about human and AI and human-machine interaction. And one is, and this reflects on all three of you comments, and this goes back to my learnings about self-driving cars and people trying to make cars self-driving or semi-automated cars. And in my conversations with leaders at Tesla, Waymo as well, it seems the hardest situations, and even I heard yesterday from one of the faculty members here, this is the reason why I like like interest and excitement and enthusiasm and investment in all these startups is waning because of the edge conditions in level X, self-driving and so on. What comes to mind is the fact that there is so much richness we don't appreciate in how human beings coordinate with each other. You mentioned, Peter, this sense for trust when we talk, how we signal each other, when we look for information, what we can expect. And just hearing a lead at Tesla, when I was visiting Tesla, mentioned to me that, boy, we're working on this really challenging, really hard problem, merging. When a car comes onto, is merging onto a freeway, you have agents and cars that are speeding by, radio on. They're merging on. And people often, you often look and you want to really, it's kind of one of these moments where human assumptions about humans, what the goals are, their intentions, who might slow, where's the position. It's so deep and rich that we haven't figured out how to even do that by not going deep enough and realizing how much we depend on so much knowledge and common sense in those situations. And there are other ones like that also. There's this whole idea of what happens at a four-way stop sign. There's lots of signaling. We heard about the pedestrian case just now and the eye contact. So I just think that we are pre-infant in work on understanding richness of coordination among agents, even with human affordances right now. And as we try to map them into human-AI collaborations or human-machine collaborations of various kinds, we're giving short shrift to how much scholarship, knowledge, and effort we need to be investing in these systems. And that applies to how we align with values as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Now we get a chance for more of a discussion among the members of the panel and Eric, back and forth. And I'm going to kind of let you guys decide how you're going to coordinate that. We'll see. Cool.
Get signals here.
So someone speak up. It's an emerging problem.
Yes, the merging problem, right? Conceptual merging.
I can start.
Yeah.
My point that AI is changing us, I feel I'm a little changed just because I deal with language so much. I do natural language processing and I deal with computers. So I think I have a hunch for figuring out how many words somebody says. And what I sense among what you said, I think together had a very high frequency. The word together, you mentioned it many times. And I really think
We're together.
the word together.
Oh, interesting.
In different contexts, whether it's human together or human AI together. And in a way, I think that's something that we miss ourselves as humans, thinking of us as together or as a group. We see the emergence of different issues among minorities. I read this book by Bill Gates on how to avoid a climate disaster. And I think the final argument was if we think of this as being in it together, then we'll think of it more actively, but that's really not what we see worldwide. So companies will think of their immediate interest and then just go with that, as opposed to really thinking we are on this planet. If we lose it, who cares about how much money I have in the bank? So in a way, maybe that's something that we could learn. I very much agree with the coevolution. So it seems that you agree with my argument that AI is changing us and we are changing AI, so we'll have to co-evolve. But can we somehow instill that sense, which we don't seem to have that well instilled in us as a large human society, of togetherness? And so if we could somehow think of both ourselves being in it together, whatever that it is, but also humans and AI being in it together, I think some of the problems that were raised of, say, moral judgment and a lot of the other things will really just come out as a natural solution. So it will be evolution, right? So if we want to survive, we don't have a shared gene. So if we make the argument of the surviving gene, okay, AI maybe doesn't share a gene with us, but if we manage somehow to instill that sense of well, if humans are not around anymore, maybe AIs will not be around anymore. So having that shared gene spirit and trying to be in it together and survive together, that maybe will have as a side effect, like resolving all of these problems.
Mic on? Yeah, no mic and mask is probably a bad combination.
Yeah. So one thing that's come up in your remarks and some of the remarks in this group are thinking of this as a developmental problem in much the same way that we think of child development. And one thing that's very interesting about watching the literature on child development, and Rick referred to this, is how quickly children develop the capacity not only to understand the sort of implicit norms of a situation, but also to have some degree of willingness to question or change those norms, so that even at very young age, if the teacher in a class asks them to do something they think is really wrong, they'll resist that. And so I'm wondering to what extent in your own experience or in Microsoft or more generally, the human development model is figuring in, thinking about how we take these systems to the level of this kind of a capacity. It's one thing to give them a huge amount of texts or images. I suppose watching videos is a bit like the child watching the environment around them. But in terms of these questions of building something like a theory of mind, building language competencies, how much has the human development model played a role?
It's an interesting question. I'd say on the technical side, we have areas of study like curriculum learning, which is explicitly about how do you sequence the experiences and knowledge to a system so it becomes more ideal at a task. There's also related notions that we call lifelong machine learning, where a system is immersed in the world and explicit mechanisms for what does a computing system do actively and passively to do lifelong learning over time, typically also as the world changes, because the world's dynamic, so it has to stay abreast and stay fresh and so on. In fact, next week we're presenting a paper, my little research group, on continual learning in a kitchen, running with clip and a whole lens as you're working with food daily, and once in a while you tell the system, oh yeah, I call that a salt taker, and it sees it from different locations, and it's different lighting conditions, and it's trying to generalize and learn how to recognize better and the language that you use to refer to things, foreshadowing a future helpful chef or sous chef with you that might work with you. So I think we have notions of this. I see besides basic metaphors, I don't see that concept used very often when it comes to building large-scale models and so on. People might say, oh, we're still at a baby stage right now, but they don't see the idea of which is a really interesting one, going to the psychology literature and education literature of how human beings learn, especially when they're very young, and so on. By the way, as you were talking, I was thinking just now about your tree and cat example, and back to the kids again and their learning. So in some ways, when kids hear rules like, do not cross the street without my hand, or on your own, or don't climb in trees, they're hearing at some point a rule that they haven't figured out yet why it exists, but there's trust in this rule maker. So it's not even a notion of you question, because you don't understand the world yet well enough. And at some point, you begin to learn about, risk-averse mom. I understand she thinks I'm going to fall. I know the probabilities of that. I kind of get that rule now, and she probably would even modify it if I could speak to her right now, but she's not available, and that cat needs my help. So there's a really rich causal common sense learning that has to have grown between when that rule was first mentioned, for good reason, because there was no knowledge there probably about why one should not do something or should do something. So it's interesting to think about you know, what happens even with values and the learnings that go on that lets a kid say, you know, even when the teacher, you know, puts the hand on the hip, like, I got it. I did some consequential reasoning here, and I understand why the rule is here.
Mention something about how just hearing what all three of you have just said has changed the way I'm thinking about something. So in my remarks, I was imagining a possible future where AI might play a causal role in changing our human values. Now I'm realizing that's a virtual certainty, you know, because we are co-evolving, right? It will happen, and maybe it will happen through, you know, really kind of interesting ways about having an ethical assistant, and that could be beneficial. But I guess it is something to keep an eye on, you know, because the kinds of illustrations that Rada gave about how, you know, AIs, you know, we're already basically we're adaptive systems, and we will adapt to the environments that we construct. Even though we think we're building those environments for us, we're also adapting to them, and so they are changing us. And we have to keep an eye on whether we like that, you know, that adaptive trajectory that we're going on.
And speaking of that, and going back to your comments, Rick, earlier about the bounded optimal way to do rewards to achieve what you want, the idea of the requirements to be transparent and explicit. Transparency is part of the trust model, Peter. I mean, and explicit when rewards are coming based on a set of goals that we specify as humans that don't feel so good, rewards and punishments, right? If we really believe that, oh, we have the model right now, and the system we've imbued with understands our bounded constraints. It knows that I want to eat that chocolate ice cream and all, you know, all this behavioral nudging business. But we have to sort of understand deeply and trust whatever model that it's a human-oriented or self-oriented model that is leading to these awful, maybe unpleasant rewards. We'll call it rewards for now because it's a positive way of stating it. That's trying to that will modify me in ways that I want to become. That could be also the same for humanity. So I'm not so sure how tenable that is, because I think humanity will want to basically have interactions that typically tend to continue to feel good, and that's going to be a certain interesting constraint, whether under that bounded optimal reward policy we can get to where we want to be. That's one comment I had to what Rick was saying earlier, which I thought was very interesting and thought-provoking for me. And several other thoughts came up about our ability to work with very powerful systems and our desire to and the need. In many examples that I look at, whether it be a system that helps a human with chess, or Rick's example of the system knows my bounded cognition and it's going to help reward me. The huge risk, and it's obvious, is that an AI system comes to learn our weaknesses and how to reward us in ways to achieve goals that we don't understand that it has, whether in Rick's earlier comments they're emergent in a mysterious way, or whether there's a malevolent human source of where they're coming from. So seeking, I would say, protections early on, like transparency, explainability, a rich and expressive ability to explain in a deep way with confirmation and verification what's going on to people who might not understand the complexities, or I should say including people who might not understand or have the time given their constraints in their cognition, will be really important. Yesterday, I mentioned about this chess example that I didn't include in my talk because we just didn't have time to fit it in. it basically, what I mentioned briefly in the Q&A, that, okay, well, we have a system now that since chess is now at a level where humans can't really add to it, even in centaur chess, with time to think, according to some of the best chess players. Oh, so the chess machine will now be helping and teaching instead of competing, and it's in a new role right now. Well, the chess machine and these new the ideas about chess, the title of the paper was like, how do you work with a superhuman chess player? It could predict with really impressive accuracy the move that a human would make at a certain level of ELO score. And also, it knew exactly where the blunders were. Now take that model to an adversarial AI agent in the world, and it makes the hair stand up in the back of your neck. And so how can we basically really work hard? What are the protections? Where do the values come from? Should they not be emergent? Right? Or if they're emergent, what are the values? And understanding that and getting ahead of that is going to be so important for where we go, I think. And I feel sometimes like, oh, am I becoming like one of these? I shouldn't say one of these. Am I becoming somebody who's concerned about like runaway AI and long-term futures and AI takeovers? And I would say, no, I haven't been concerned like that. But there is this merger of like, where are things going? And maybe is there a glimmer there of, it won't be exactly like what some of those folks who have been on that for decades say, but might it be kind of sort of similar where we might head if we don't get our act together and really get on this with all the scholarship we have to put into this and all the influence we have as academics, as industry, as civil society?
I would like to just add to that because I've been thinking about that as well. And I think it's a very interesting point on how somehow AI can figure out our weaknesses and then just go for that Achilles hip. And I'm thinking of a conversation I had again with Ben a while back about how corporations in a way are artificial beings. So it's not the same meaning that we assign to artificial intelligence because obviously there are humans behind it, but they act in certain ways. So a lot of what you've been saying, it's been happening already, where there are corporations that figure out, for instance, that we like ourselves. We like to take pictures of ourselves and put them for others to admire. And so just going after that weakness, we eventually are now addicted. And we already see the bad impacts, like mental health and a lot of the other things, because we see all these perfect human beings around us, and we wonder about ourselves and all everything that comes there, which is downhill. So in a way, I think we already have at least part of that happening, and so already have the things to think with, like what now? So making that analogy between corporations and artificial beings, how do we handle that? Like, and this artificial being leveraging our weaknesses, which is already happening, and how do we deal with that?
And let me just add on that a bit, besides trying to, in lieu of jumping in with a great answer. And that is, I won't say company names or people's names, but in the early life of a company that we all know very well, happens to not be Microsoft in this case, a colleague who went over there was a top-notch machine learning person. Said, well, how's it going? What are you doing? And he said, my main project right now is I'm working to figure out, and I have all this data, how to increase the time someone spends on this app. And it's great. I get rewarded by looking at distributions and getting my machine learning algorithms, look at all the inputs and what's going on, and make it longer on average. So my reaction to that was, wow, we're having, whether it's a company or for any goal, in this case it was just revenue for advertising, because there might be a link between how long you're on a site and how many ads you look at, for example. So let's say it's a revenue thing. Stay on the site longer. I've started viewing what's happening in the world right now, and this is today's world, as AI, machine learning, is with lots of data, is being applied to do denial of service attacks on human attention. And it's like, wow. my first reaction was this. Number one, transparency. Back to my comment about goals before. Should Facebook and Microsoft and Google and small startups, New York Times, because they optimize headlines as well, for example, right? Should there be a disclaimer when you come onto these sites? This application has been optimized to keep you here, using these sources and signals, and here's how well it's working with you over the last few months. It's like a surgeon's general warning on a pack of cigarettes, right? And so starting with transparency, I'm not saying we're going to solve the problem with just transparency alone, but these are big concerns right now. And I don't think many people think when they come on to like a social media site that there are powerful algorithms processing large amounts of multimodal data that's designed to keep you there as long as possible.
That reminds me, I've often wished that there were a personal AI agent that was looking out for my interests in these cases. So rather than depend on the New York Times to put the disclaimer up there, I've got I have something standing in between me and the corporations with all of their big data that's looking out for my interests and helping me to, beat them at their own game in some sense.
Yeah, we mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment that some people that I've known are starting to do very simple things that are powerful, like a family member sets a timer on TikTok. So put a timer on there, and it's like, you've had your 7 minutes. You're out. Oh, sorry, Peter.
Yeah. So, so one thought that you might have here is, we talked about flourishing briefly last time, and one surprising thing that comes out of the literature on well-being is that there are activities that increase our well-being that we don't spend much time in, and activities that tend to decrease our well-being that we spend a lot of time in. And these algorithms are very good at pulling us into the ones that are actually decreasing our well-being. And this is especially a problem, I guess, when they can measure it with young people. And so I'm wondering, wouldn't part of the ethics of developing AI systems be thinking, okay, we can achieve this task of getting people to spend more time, maybe even the task of reminding them, but how would we think about the question of what's this effect on the well-being of the individual or the learning of the individual? And do we have oversight on that? And that would be maybe within a corporation or across corporations.
We have self-oversight over that.
Yeah. Yeah. And how would we enhance that aspect of intelligence? Yeah.
I find it's a fabulous comment.
Great. That is an excellent point for moving on to the more general discussions. And as yeah, right. And as I've said before, we do have the 2 microphones here, and so please line up for those microphones. I'm going to take advantage of my situation and ask a question. And this is for everybody. I'd like to follow up on the theme that Rada was introducing, which is we've been talking about the need for AIs, among other things, to develop a certain amount of ethics of their own. And we've been talking about the fact that our own humanity, including our ethics, is going to be influenced by the tools that we interact with. But I think we need to pay more attention to the notion that corporations are artificially intelligent entities. They're not digital computers, but they are made of people, but also of information and business processes, and they have certain goals, and there are certain ideologies that provide relatively simple ethical structures that many corporations, not all, have really bought into. And we need to ask whether those ethical, what kind of ethics do we want corporate AIs to have, corporations considered as AIs?
Alex, first on this.
Well, it does help us to understand. Sometimes corporations have emergent goals. They're not the goals of any particular agents within them, but it's the result of the way these different interactions occur within the corporation and what incentives it's responding to. And one thing that this can help us think about is the idea that there can be agents with whom we have to develop an ethical mode of interaction. And it's not because it's a question of sentience exactly, because there isn't a sentient mind containing that emergent goal as a corporation. And so perhaps we could be more liberal in our thinking about interacting ethically with AI systems and asking, okay, they're emerging amongst us. What kind of a community are we creating for them? How are we shaping the kind of agents that they're going to become by the way that we behave toward these artificial systems? And that can be a question on this level of functional operation, rather than thinking, until we have something more like a human agent, we should not be asking about these questions. Well, what about our effects on it?
Yeah. Well, companies certainly have values that go beyond the constraints, for example, of good business behavior and what's required of a business, let's say in the United States, for example, or in a state. They have a mission statement that the companies tend to try to live up to. I think they do often. There's leadership at the top level that exude values and ethics during their term of leadership. When I hear Satya Nadella quote Colin Mayer, and he really believes it, Colin Mayer, an economist, believes that companies should be pursuing profitable solutions to really hard challenges of people in society. That's the goal. If you do that well, sure, that should be profitable. And if you do it in a very novel and interesting way, an organization should be rewarded for that. But finding those and making that the selection process, I think is very interesting for a company. And that's a value. That's a value judgment. So I think this should is yes, absolutely.
I'll just add one little bit, which is that I've been often thinking on how, at least I believe, we've been acquiring moral values as humans. I'm a big believer in evolutionary psychology. And one of my favorite books of all times is The Moral Animal, on how we become generous over time. It's really not because we want necessarily the others' well-being, but it's because we feel pleasure in giving to others. And so it's that kind of reward. So I know it's more hypothetical thinking, but in a way, I think acquiring that moral judgment, either for AI or these artificial beings, which are corporations, in a way that's more akin to evolutionary psychology, I think will be a more natural way to do it. So back to my earlier note of being in it together, so if we can somehow have a system in place that corporations will not necessarily only think of how much money I'll have at the end of the year. It's more like, if this planet will disappear, then what? So longer term, I think that will instill certain moral judgments which are longer term, which is really to your point, think of big problems as opposed to end of year, which I'm not suggesting that all companies will do that.
Let's have you're next, then you. We'll continue. Yes.
Hello. Okay. Thank you for the amazing panel, and it actually makes me rather optimistic toward AI, whereas I used to be, a bit pessimistic about, all the ethics and everything about artificial intelligence. So you all mentioned like humans' ability to, adapt and to learn. It's like we have this default system or default trust to just incorporate those things like driving a car or learning a language. But it's just occurred to me that I feel like just for small kids, like for children or for young people, it's actually easier to learn things. And when people grow older, they seem to, just digest slowly. Because I'm only 22, but I feel like at this age, when I'm trying to learn a new language, it's just not as easy as I do it when I was young. And I believe that a machine also has this stage that, it's just saturated. It can't have more storage. Yeah, I just wonder what you think of that.
I will only make a comment. It's not an answer that I actually do believe that people can learn a language at any age. It's more of our own belief or what society imposes on us. Like, if you grow older, you cannot learn. I don't think that's true, which I don't know how that would answer necessarily what you said and how it would translate in an AI.
Go ahead.
Hello, and thanks for the wonderful discussion. My question is more about data. So we know systems like GPT-3 or the Microsoft Turing models, they rely on like terabytes of data generated by people. And like you mentioned the example of social media, and when I go on social media, I would like to watch cat videos, but like in essence, it's really work, right? Like I'm generating data, or I'm trying to like maximize the time I'm spending on Twitter or TikTok. And so anyway, like a lot of these recent developments in AI have this assumption that we're gonna just get more and more data from humans, right? And I guess my question is, what really makes you think that we will, at some point not stop giving you our data for free? And by you, I mean like AI companies. And what do you think, like what are the implications of that? And do you even see that happening?
I see you're locking eyes with me. So that's is that a question for me?
You're the AI
Sure.
company.
Okay, AI company, the being that has evolved as an AI company. So I think there's some really interesting issues that will come to the fore, and there's already discussions going on about whether if somebody sees, if an artist who's worked really hard over the years with a particular style has generated a whole bunch of artwork, and if somebody else using, let's say, one of these multimodal models puts in in the style of artist, and it's like, wow, look at that. I have something in the style of that artist.
Or Copilot.
Or Copilot. And so the idea is, do artists and software engineers feel like they're helping other people out? Maybe they want some attribution. Maybe they want a link somehow. Maybe they want reimbursement in some. They maybe want their copyright. There's also interesting nuances of copyright law, which I've been investigating, because I'm actually interested in these questions. And we'd definitely be, when I mentioned in the longer term yesterday in my talk, concerns which are coming to the fore now about the role of the human creator versus the AI. There's also the idea of the role of the human creator in a community of other humans that are using AI systems that have benefited from the creative contributions of the individual, the initial individual contributor. And my understanding is, from talking to legal people, just to understand better where we are with today's copyright law. It doesn't mean we shouldn't evolve this, which is an interesting question and direction. they talk about the transformational aspects. If something transforms the original content in some way, there's quite a bit of leniency in the transformational content, the transformational process in saying, that's okay, it's not the same thing, it's transformed. And so will we as a society now with AI systems have to sort of look at our values and what we mean by copyright law and transformation and change that in some way that benefits one or the other? It's a trade-off, population or the contributor. And no matter what happens there, will there be other mechanisms in place? So for example, I think, again, another set of slides that were cut by some of my colleagues because it was too long. There's something called content provenance, digitally encrypted metadata on contributions that people make, whether it's their own photos or their artwork or code, that travels along intrinsically inseparable from the contribution. So when it flies through a machine learning system of the future, there's no way to separate where pieces came from, even when generalizations occur. And some way to view that, some way to reimburse if that's part of the model. For example, or just somebody that's attribution or project a license forward if it wasn't transformed enough or in some ways. So you can imagine that we can get creative, right? It's not all dire straits for the creators. We could think through how is it going to work. Maybe there's some values changing about what it means to be a creator. Maybe it means we contribute more to human society without worrying about attribution. Maybe it means we get reimbursed with money flowing through the internet into our Venmo accounts because the provenance is being identified. So it's an interesting question.
So much.
Before we take the next question, if I may just provide an answer to the previous question that was asked, I feel like my comment maybe was dismissive and didn't really provide an answer. I think it's actually very interesting to think of how and when AI learns something. Similar to the analogy that was made with language learning, it's different if you learn, say, French after you already learned Portuguese and Spanish. I think it's a different process in the learning. And in machine learning, that's already being looked at under curriculum learning. So it's a very interesting question and something to think
Sure.
Thank you also for the panel discussion. It's been excellent, and the lecture. I wanted to ask, largely to Peter, but also somewhat to Eric from our conversation during the breakfast. There's a concept of error theory where we don't accept any moral facts as being true. And under this view, we recently read, I'm taking a class on metaethics, we recently read a piece by Richard Joyce on moral fictionalism, a way to operate when you don't accept that there aren't any moral facts, where you presume in normal life that 99% of the time you're going to act under a fiction of morality, but you do understand in the 1% of the time when you're in a philosophical context that there is no moral fact if you accept that. That it allows you to have like a way to process life, to act socially with other people in a trusting system where you presume morality as this fiction going through life, doing things, taking action, saving cats from trees. But you understand like that you have these rules and that you have these systems in place. But my professor, when we read this piece, he described it as a rather feeble piece of philosophy. He said that this only really works often in toy examples, where in real life, when you accept that if you truly accept that there is no morality, or there are no moral truths, you're going to be coming up against things that you truly value, strong economic pressures, or like a matter of reputation to finish something in some way, to finalize a project, or to put something that you've put a lot of work into, whether or not you'll have like a tension against your morality. And if you truly believe there are no moral facts, this will come into attention in a strong way. So my question is, how do we handle this tension between having morality, or like the lack thereof oftentimes as moral, as an error theory of morality often like presents in like AI systems? How do we imbue them with morality? Should we imbue them with a fiction of morality, or should we give them access to deeper moral sensibilities?
know, I was going to take start with the title of the class you're in, meta ethics, and turn things over to Peter. But my first reaction is, you asserted several assumptions, like there is a moral fact versus a moral fiction, and I'm not sure. I haven't read the piece that you mentioned, but my sense is that from the personal point of view, you can have an assessment and set of beliefs and a set of action-oriented implications of what you believe about a trade-off that I wouldn't take as a fact or a fiction, but an assessment of, at a point in time, of what one believes about what's better than what, and how to balance things, and then what the uncertainties might be, and so on. So I'd have to even even begin to answer your question. I have to know what is meant by a moral fiction. So I don't know if Peter, if this is one you've written on this topic.
You take the mask off while you speak.
Sure. First of all, there's sort of two parts to your question. To make a long story short, for the second part, ask yourself, would having a long-term relationship with a person who thought it was only a fiction, that they cared about you, be psychologically equivalent to having a relationship with that person? Seems to me the answer is no, and it's no on both sides. That person would lose something, and you would lose something as well. We've talked a lot about value here, but notice that the values that we've talked about, you don't have to think of them as values that are distinctively moral. They're values like human well-being, various forms of knowledge or accomplishment, various competing interests, and so on. And so one doesn't need a complex meta-ethic to think, no, those values are real enough. They're factors in our lives. They're things that motivate us, that we think and other people give us reason to be motivated. And so even setting aside global questions of meta-ethics, you can think, okay, good. Even setting aside global questions of meta-ethics, you could think, we actually have already enough of an understanding of why value is important and why these kinds of values figure in people's lives, that taking them seriously is not a fiction.
Thank you.
Thank you again for the amazing conversation. And I would also like to echo the sentiment that this conversation makes me feel more optimistic about the future of AI. And my question is about the values that we want to embed into our AI systems, and especially who should be the ones to determine which values that we try to imbue our agents with, especially for services that are being used worldwide, for example, search engines that people don't really have a good alternative for, so they have to use these agents. And what considerations should be made, if any, for the fact that currently AI technology, there is a disparity in who the shareholders are, major companies or certain countries. Yeah.
Colleagues here follow up. I'm often thinking of how we are individuals, but then we are also part of a group. And so in a way, I think AI should have the ability of adapt to individuals. And that's something that I'm very big on. I don't think that there is just like a unique system. And I won't go down that path of how current AI maybe is not really accounting for different groups and different beliefs. But really being able to account for different groups, whichever way we decide to consider those groups. And so that should be on one side. But then on the other side, which is really repeating myself, what I mentioned earlier, I think it's also feeling like it's part of a group itself. So having that adaptability as we do it as individuals, so I preserve my own personality of way of acting around the world. And yet I'm also part of a group of other individuals, but together then we act as a group, and we have whatever beliefs come from being part of that group, which are really strong, and I think currently are not really modeled in AIs, that power of us and feeling like us in how we react.
Hi, panelists. Thank you again for all your comments. Really great discussion. Makes me, excited to be part of the field. So I guess kind of similar to the previous question, it seems like, we can't really assume that one person or one entity can come up with a comprehensive set of values for an AI system to have. There is some advantage that AI can take in global perspectives and maybe come up with, values that suit everybody. So I guess my question is, how can we balance that with also wanting AI systems to be transparent? Like transparency seems to imply that we have a lot of control over the kind of data it sees, the ways it comes up with values. We have some understanding of how it's making the decisions it is. So I guess, what are your thoughts on how we can kind of balance both things? New emergent values maybe that we didn't think of before, but also being able to understand how it's coming up with those ideas.
Ourselves. I know at some point, we don't understand ourselves. So it's very ambitious to think of these intelligent things that will fully understand them. And also thinking of other situations we run into on a daily basis. Like if I visit a doctor, do I always understand why they made a certain decision? Maybe not. So they are expert in what they do, which is not to discourage work on transparency and explainability, but at some point, I think there will be that part where we'll not fully understand how these decisions are made, and we'll sort of have to live with that. Again, similar to the doctor situation, I don't fully understand why a doctor would make certain decisions, and even if the doctor would try to explain, maybe I wouldn't still fully understand. So that will always be there.
Oh, let's see. Yeah. I think you were here first, so go.
Thank you again, panelists. I think it's clear that our work is definitely cut out for us, but I am a bit optimistic, a little bit more than before this conversation. But one thing I was wondering about, Professor Railton pointed out that these kind of black swan situations are incredibly morally salient. Like if we walk by and we see a cat in a tree, we know we ought to help it. And or if in a self-driving car situation, if the car in front of you just happens to stop randomly, the car behind it needs to figure out what to do. And these are really rare situations that might not be present in the training data. And I'm kind of wondering, are there any approaches to making models behave predictably in these incredibly uncertain circumstances? And is our current machine learning paradigm too narrow for these kind of random contexts?
Well, I've always been really excited about open world applications, especially the tender moments when you take your system out of your lab, your CS department lab, or your industry lab, and put it out into the world and see what happens. Because you do encounter so many things that you didn't think about in advance, including non-edge, non-black swan conditions, which were black swans from the point of view of being in the lab, that are actually commonplace in the open world. So there's a whole notion of a few dimensions of this. Building systems that are robust and resilient to some of the fragilities that we see in traditional systems where we haven't thought deeply about robustness. There's a rising mini area of machine learning on robust machine learning, for example, that does better with distributional changes in the world, or some certain kinds of attacks for adversarial machine learning, which is another source of interesting black swans you didn't expect. When there's an adversary that's going to somehow figure out how to make your system believe things that aren't classify things that aren't there as being there. And then you need ongoing, the monitoring we talked about yesterday, as well as even ongoing study. So at Microsoft, we have a reliability and safety working group in our responsible AI area, co-chaired by someone from the product team and from Microsoft Research, with a working group that's really thinking about these issues in the context and more general, but in the context of Microsoft's products and services, but also more generally from the point of view of research. So I think it's just a really interesting problem to think about this robustness, general recoverability, resilience of our systems, self-knowledge of their own fragility. I mean, years ago, we built these machine learning systems, and you turn the lights on or the lights off or put a different light on in your office, and they just wouldn't work because they weren't trained with that lighting. And we have to consider those things. You know, Jenna Weens and I, years ago, you know, we were looking at, if you take a model built for one hospital and you move it into another hospital, you have to really do lots of thinking about how do you change that model to perform at the same levels of accuracy when it was trained on lots of data from that first hospital and less data on the second hospital. So we have these are real problems, and includes things you might come to expect as a machine learning researcher and as a professional in that space, as well as beyond the black swan events, which are part of this idea of trying to pursue more generally resilience in your systems.
Thank you. Robustness and monitoring seem like really fascinating. I got to check those out.
Okay, now it turns out we only have time for 2 more questions. Now, fortunately, this is evidence that these are important hot topics, and everybody really needs to be able to think about these and discuss them with each other. We have the lunch after this, when there'll be plenty of time to discuss it with other people. And so everybody needs to be discussing this, not just the panelists and not just the people explicitly working in it. And I think you came up after a number of people in line here, so you are next and you are last. Go ahead.
Okay, hi, my name is Shelby Pitts again. This is not really a question, but more so just several comments that I had on the talk. Okay, so a book I read, well, really a compoundment of articles, Studying Those Who Study Us, an Anthropologist in the World of Artificial Intelligence by Dr. Diana Forsyth. And in this paper, she is arguing that there is a hierarchy of sciences itself that places engineering and computer science above the humanities and social sciences. And give me a second. So this hierarchy, yeah, it impedes the ability to design accessible and efficient systems. So I think that when we're thinking about intelligence itself, or who is in the room, it's important to bring in people that have that type of perspective. To talk about Rada's point about how we are talking to Siri or other technology and how that can hurt our ability to be respectful towards one another. There is a paper by tech ethics professor Dr. Shannon Fowler called Moral Descaling and Upscaling in a New Machine Age, Reflections of the Ambiguous Future of Character. And in this example, she's talking about how if we automate care work for older people, that lack of experience of taking care of other people will kind of impact how we can care for other people out in wider society. And I thought that was an interesting point of how are we actually able to cultivate important values ourselves if certain actions are being automated. And then my last point to talk about AI ethics and how, from a quick article from the MIT Tech Review, What Buddhism Can Do for AI Ethics. Guidelines reflect the values of people who issue them. And the most AI ethics guidelines are being written in Western countries, means that the field is dominated by Western values such as respect for autonomy and the rights of individuals. But in the East, so this person argues that insights derived from Buddhist teachings could benefit anyone working on AI ethics because it has a just different point of view of more collectivist and community-oriented values. And so I think when we're thinking about values themselves, we have to decenter the West as leading or cultivating most of the values that we have now. But I guess I just wanted to talk about, or just be up here as someone who majored in anthropology and got some flack from it, that I think that that type of science is still valued. But if we do not value it or esteem it to the same way that we value engineering, then the future won't be as good as it can be. Thanks.
If I just make a comment, I was very close colleagues with Diana Forsyth. She was, when I was a grad student, she hovered over my shoulder almost all the time. And we had lots of conversations, and she had significant influence on me.
Me too. Thank you.
Fortunately, she passed away quite young.
Yeah, 97 in a hiking accident.
She was crossing a river in Alaska, so it's a sad loss to the field.
I just wanted to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going because you brought the keyword Western, and something that I've been thinking a lot lately, even starting to prepare an argument I could make, is about how AI is weird, where weird is that title of
Western,
a book.
educated, industrial, R, and democratic.
Rich and democratic.
Yes.
And I think AI is weird. And I do believe we have a lot to learn from anthropologists and others in how we approach it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And one of the things we might hope for, actually, from artificial intelligence is that it would be able to fuse value schemes better. So, Rada, you mentioned the idea of doing things together or seeing ourselves together. And it may be that a highly individualistic ethic that perhaps is dominant in Western societies is going to limit our ability to solve certain very important problems. On the other hand, a collective ethic requires perhaps addition of individual values. And so one thing we could hope is that by interacting more widely, and as an anthropologist would, doing more field work with these systems, we'll come up with value schemes that aren't just the ones that we have, and that could enable us to solve problems that we're not doing a very good job of solving.
And speaking of field work, I really had the sense when Diana Forsyth was in our lab doing her field work that I was part of some archaeological dig.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Last question.
Thank you for the panel. So my question has to do with looking at corporations as agents, specifically like social media corporations. Because it seems to me like, agents have objectives. And in social media companies, their objectives are, one, to create value for the user, which I think they do, because obviously it's a wonderful thing to be able to keep in touch with family and friends that you don't see frequently, but also to create value for shareholders. And as we talked about, one of the ways that they do that is by capturing and monetizing human attention. And I guess it seems to me right now that the sort of drawbacks to the users outweigh the benefits, in that there are negative effects on mental health and well-being, and then it also seems like the potential for social media as a sort of political arena makes the possibility of a post-epistemic world more likely. So, and then you mentioned transparency as a potential mitigating strategy, and it got me thinking about how like iPhones have a screen time little display. It tells you how much time you spend on your phone. And I guess my question is, have you thought of, or are you aware of other mitigating strategies, in development? And also, do you think that those strategies should come from within industry, or at some point does there need to be some kind of just regulatory oversight?
It is on. So immediate reaction is that we will need some regulatory oversight. Also because there are pretty much any technology you can think of, you can also turn it around. For instance, I was discussing recently with one of my students how we could develop NLP technologies that would convince people to have a behavior change which is helping with their well-being, for instance, taking more steps or sleeping more. But immediately you can think of how you can turn that kind of technology around and persuade people to buy stuff. And so unless there is some regulation in place, should we decide not to even think of this kind of technology that will help people have better behavior, like for their own health? Or should we do that, but then have that regulation that will forbid the use of that technology for other purposes? So that's my take on it.
I don't know of any area of human life or industry where we think self-regulation is all the regulation that's needed. There need to be other kinds of bodies involved. And I was it's amazing in a way how much it seems Microsoft has thought about ethics in doing its work, and to be congratulated on that. But we're also in a world of many bad actors. We're in a world not just of commercial bad actors, but of political bad actors. And that's a task of regulation that goes beyond what we should expect from any self-regulatory mechanism.
Thank you.
There's obviously much more to be said, but let us thank the panel and the audience for all the questions and discussion. Fortunately, we have the lunch coming after, at which all of us can discuss with all of us about these various issues, and these issues are going to continue to press on us for coming decades, as we have seen. Now, we've had a very, very stimulating couple of days. And I think all of us are moved and seriously affected by the experiences we've had over the last couple of days. And I'd like to start by thanking all of you, because your role has been very important in this. And there are a few others that we need to thank. I'd like to thank the Tanner Foundation for their thoughtful creation of a funding mechanism for bringing thoughtful people to think about fundamental hard problems and tell us where they are in that process. And of course, that is a process, and it's far from done. But getting updated on that is incredibly valuable and incredibly important. And I'd like to thank several university presidents who have contributed to the role that the University of Michigan gets to play in this. I'd like to thank Dean Alec Gallimore, who will speak in just a minute, for his support of the process for putting this all together. I'd like to thank the Rackham staff, the AV staff, the people who have helped put the reception and the meals together. They have done a wonderful job. And I have to single out and really thank Emily Dickman, who has just done an outstanding job. And I think about what it would do to me if I were trying to do this job without her, and I would be crumbled in a puddle on the floor. The stuff that is necessary to make this happen is just a very special talent. So thanks to everybody, and thanks to Alec, and I'm going to let him have the last word.
Thank you. Well, first, I'd be remiss if we didn't thank Professor Ben Kuipers for organizing this and leading the effort here. It'd be great. Eric, thank you. It was great to meet you. Thank you for visiting us and making the trip. And for my colleagues on the panel, Peter, Rick, and Rada, you remind us why it's great to be a Michigan Wolverine. It's really an honor to serve with you. Also want to recognize the people from the Tanner Lecture Board who will participate in this as well. I also want to add my thank you for the audience here. And this is to the students in particular. Students, I've always thought that the most accomplished scholars that I know are the ones who are most comfortable acknowledging what they don't know as what they know and can wax eloquently about in depth. And I'd like to acknowledge that this panel has been a really great model for doing that. I also feel good about the future because of you all here, not just our panelists, but our faculty members, our staff, and our students who are here as well. And I want to end by a very brief story, very brief, because I know I'm between you and caloric intake. I was at a leadership event many years ago when I was a junior faculty member or so, and there was the canoe problem. And the canoe problem is that there are 3 people on the canoe, but you can only save 2 of them. One is your partner, your significant other, one is your child, and one is your parent. And so it was a diverse group of folks, and they took a poll and they said, okay, who what. And so people from one group, including my group, said, of course you would save your child. And they said, well, why would you save your child? Well, because your child hasn't had an opportunity to live a full life, and there's great potential in this child. I might add, no one picked the significant other or the spouse. But other groups saved their parent, their mother in particular. And we asked the question, why did you save your mom? And said, well, I can always have another child. I cannot have another mom. I say this because we're talking about, the 7,000 languages and the myriad cultures that we have on our planet. And we think about values. And what does values mean when a group of people in a room can't even decide to save a parent versus a child? And how do you train an AI agent to think about that? One word, diversity. That's why it's important to have a diverse framework and people from all cultures weigh in on this, including anthropologists. So with that, thank you very much, and thank you for inspiring me, making me feel good about the future. Enjoy lunch.